Bible reading today is Daniel chapter 3. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubes high and 60 cubes wide, and set it up high on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, and magistrates, and all the other provinces' officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So satraps, prefects, governors, So King Nebuchadnezzar had set up and stood before. He heralded loudly, proclaimed, nations and people of every language, "This is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold and that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Who does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown in the blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all other kinds of music, all the nations and people of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that who does not fall down and worship will be thrown in the blazing furnace."
But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against their God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
What we've just had read out is one of a few passages in this particular book that are some of the most well-known parts of the Bible. That even today, there would be many people who have never read the Bible or have even read the book of Daniel, and yet despite this, they'd probably still be familiar with many of the events spoken about both here in this chapter and in what will be the next few chapters as well. And that's because chapter 3 that we're looking at today is a story known as the fiery furnace, where 3 men are thrown into a massive furnace to be killed because of their stance against what was a new law that had just been brought in. And yet, despite being thrown into something that should have caused their certain death, we see that this event ends up somehow with a 4th person in the furnace, walking around the flames, and then the original 3 that were thrown in there, well, they somehow walk out without even having a singe. That they have no harm done to them by the fire at all, whilst even those who threw them into the furnace were actually killed by the flames because it was that hot. And this event, of course, shows us what is a couple of things. We can learn a lot from what happens here in chapter 3, as the record of this event teaches us some important truths about trusting in God and how God's plans work and how he puts them into effect in this world. So obviously, for one, we see how God miraculously works in this situation by protecting his people from what should have been, yes, a certain death. And that the 4th mysterious person shows that it wasn't just luck that they survived, someone didn't make the fire hot enough, or that these 3 men have some kind of superpowers. They're not invincible to the flames, but that God was active and right there keeping them alive. But of course, the other big thing we see in all this is what a faithful person is to do when it comes to living in a world that does not only worship God, but it doesn't want you to worship him either, and will even want you to worship something that goes against him. That the big thing happening here is that God's people are being forced to worship something set up by this Babylonian king, and to do so would mean that they have to betray their conscience and they have to go against God himself. They've got to betray him. And because they can't do this, this is why they end up in this furnace, because they refuse to follow the law, and the consequences of doing that is a death sentence. And it is this part, this issue, that is relevant for us and is even an ongoing theme in the Bible, as there are many occasions where God's people are given a choice of following the laws of the land or following God's ways, and that when they choose the latter, they often face persecution for it. That a choice to follow God can come with a consequence, but that the faithful person will still willingly make that right choice, no matter what that may result in. So, for example, there's a well-known story in Acts 4, where we see that Peter and the apostles have been telling people about Jesus and even doing miracles in his name. And then because of this, they're then dragged before the Sanhedrin, who are the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and they say to them in verse 18 of Acts 4 that they must not speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus, which Peter says to them in verse 20, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard, because in verse 19, he had also said to them, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to listen to him, you be the judges, which in other words is his response to their demand being, we have to do what God says and not you, and if that causes a problem with you, well, so be it. That the attitude they had, and the attitude we actually see throughout the rest of the New Testament, is that we are going to proclaim the gospel, and if we get jailed or if we get beaten or even get killed for doing that, then that is simply the cost of following God. That is just what his disciples are called to do. and that we're not going to give up or be frightened into retreating, but we're going to stand strong and keep doing this until the end. And while this was the situation God's people have always needed to face, both back here in books like Daniel and also in the New Testament, also in other times in church history and even around the world today, we see Christians are still being persecuted for their faith. So this is something which is just goes along with being a Christian, having faith. And therefore, it's a situation that's becoming relevant even for ourselves today, as we are also starting to find that we're being told what we can and cannot teach and do in Jesus' name, and that is creating problems for us. Because even in Australia, in just recent years, we have witnessed laws being made that churches are struggling to comply with, so they now actually run the risk of huge fines, even possibly jail time if they break those laws. And because of this, churches now have to ask, where is the line? Where do I follow the law like a good citizen, and as a Christian should do, we should follow the laws of the land? And where do I risk breaking laws and being thrown into the furnace because I must ultimately follow God's ways? That there's a higher calling on us and what we are to do. Because there have been obvious examples of this in just recent years. At this moment, there is an anti-conversion bill in Victoria which effectively stops ministers and church leaders even praying with an LGBT person, even when it is done in private, and even when that person has requested that the person pray for them. That somehow we've actually ended up with laws in Australia regulating how we are to pray with someone. And of course, the position many ministers in Victoria have had to take is that we just can't go along with that. So I'm going to do it, and arrest me if you must, but I will pray even if you tell me not to. That they have had to make a stand, just like the apostles did in Acts 4, because such a law is just outrageous, and no Christian could possibly go against go with a rule that forbids or tries to regulate prayer. They've got to go against that. So we are, in fact, already seeing, just in the last couple of years, situations, even in Australia, of how government rules can start to say, we will tell you how to worship and how you minister to people. And it raises a question for us: when do you give into this? When do you make a stand? And if you do choose to make a stand, if you won't go along with it, how far will you go in that stand? Right? Do you make a stand only until it just gets too hot to deal with, and then you just give in, you just go along? Or do you fight to the end, and no matter how dire it may get, you just simply never say die? You never get pushed into or scared into sinning against God and going against his ways, and certainly not ever getting to the point of renouncing your faith. And that issue of how to deal with such situations is exactly what we see in this passage here. It shows us how not to give in and how to stand strong, even in the threat of death, and when a society starts making rules that go against the very things that God commands us to do or not to do. So looking at the passage now, and looking at what the big issue is that those in exile in Babylon are going to have to face, as well as what will be the consequences of choosing not to go along with these rules, not going along with the sinful ways of this Babylonian culture. Well, we see here, it starts by saying King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, and set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So this is going to be what is the catalyst of the problem. The king has made what is essentially an idol to worship. And this was, of course, a very common thing in pagan nations. They all did stuff like this. And this particular object, it could have been of their god, Marduk. That's a high possibility. It could have even very likely have been of the king himself, right? That was also a very common thing for rulers to do back then, make a big statue of themselves for the people to worship. But whatever the case, this is simply an idol that they're being told to worship. And its size shows us just how important this was for the king, and therefore how much he's most likely going to insist that people do worship it. Because when we look at the size, it actually is quite incredible. It says here that it was 60 cubits high. So probably in our measurements, this is roughly about 25 to 30 meters high. Or maybe you could say 8, 9, even 10 stories high. So if you built something like this, down in the main street in the middle of Tamworth, it would be by far the tallest thing in town, right? It's about nearly 9 or 10 stories high. It is absolutely massive. So it shows that he has a reason for this. He's not going to make something so big and out of gold of all materials for no purpose, right? There's an obvious reason, and we get it, because as we read on, he then says, he then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provisional officers to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. And then it says in verse 3 that they came to this dedication. And then in verse 4 and 5, we read, then the herald proudly proclaimed, nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So everyone in the country, everyone in this nation, this empire, they now have to worship this idol of gold on command. That they've got to fall before it, as it must be treated basically like a god. And it's now the law of the land to do this. So it means that you don't have a choice in this matter. You are being forced to worship this image of gold. And then to make matters worse, we then see what happens if you don't, right? How are they going to force you to do it? What are the consequences of breaking this command? Because it says in verse 6, whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So there's even a death penalty for breaking this law. It's not just a fine or a jail sentence or something like that, but if you don't worship it, you will be immediately burnt alive, which, as you would imagine, was a good motivator for the people. And we see that because it says in verse 7, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So this is the issue that needs to be dealt with here. You've got to worship this idol of gold or be killed, and we see that everyone just goes along with it. As we looked at before, people who are in Babylon, they have come from many nations as the empire has continuously and rapidly expanded, and it's taken in many different cultures. And yet, despite what is their own beliefs, they have all obeyed this law, even though that would go against their own religion. That the fear of the furnace here is enough for everyone to compromise their beliefs and then worship this idol. But as we read on, we find that it is not, in fact, everyone going along with this, as there are a few who are going to make a stand. That whilst others, they're willing to compromise their beliefs and simply go along with the command, the big thing here is, and the big example really for us today, the big point we're going to get from this is how 3 prominent members of God's people and 3 prominent members of Babylon, for that matter, they refuse to do this, and they're prepared to lose everything, as this is a line they won't cross. That as God has said to his people, and as what are the first 2 commandments in the 10 commandments, what they state is, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not make for yourself an image, and you shall not bow down to them or worship them. Then obviously what is being expected of them to do here is impossible and would cause them to directly violate their worship of God. God has already said, do not do this, and been very clear about it. So we then read in verse 8, it says, at this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. So we see here that the Jews, how many of them we don't know, probably more than just the 3 here, but certainly the Jews will not go along with this, and they are clearly not falling before this idol whilst everyone else does. And that is because others have noticed them not following the command, so they're now reporting them. This is why they're now getting in trouble. People are going, these guys aren't falling down. We better go tell the king. And whilst others are complying, we see that God's people, at least some of them, they're refusing to worship the idol. And because of that, they've now been caught. That's where the problem's coming in. And then through verses 9 to 12, we see how those who notice this defiance, well, they make it their job to go remind the king of the law that has been put to do this and the consequences of not worshipping and breaking that law. So they're pointing out in verse 12 that these 3 Jews who are in high places in the king's government aren't doing this. And they say to the king, they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. So it's not just that these 3 Jewish people here are not following the law. That's the problem. But it's also that they're in high positions, so that has got others now reporting on them to get them killed. Because of their position in the empire, it's now come to the attention of the king. So this is what's going to cause all the problems for them. Because it says in verse 13, on hearing the news, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then we see in the following verses that he gives them one last chance to do this. He lays down the law, and with a warning of what would happen if they don't comply. And again, we see this being given in verse 15. If you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand. So what we're seeing now, they're at the point where there is no opportunity to just ignore the law and then just go about their lives in the hope that no one's noticing. That the chance of breaking this law out of devotion to God, but doing it quietly and therefore without consequence because no one sees that they're breaking it, well, it's no longer an option. Because now they are before the king himself. And he's saying to him, again, he's making it clear, do this now or you will be immediately killed. Making it very clear, this is what you have to do. So this is an example where God's people can find themselves in a situation where they have to make a choice. Because in many situations, you can go against the law and no one will notice. You could get away with it. The apostles, for example, often told people about Jesus and they did get away with it, as they simply didn't get caught every time that they were out there doing it. And even right now, I've got no doubt, there are probably people in Victoria praying with people in the LGBT community, and as no one has reported it, well, they're getting away with it, right? There's no consequence. Even though the law says you can't, there's no consequence of what they're doing. But what we see here is there can be times like this where it goes from the quiet protest to now having to publicly make a choice, publicly even make a stand. And when that happens, it really is putting your money where your mouth is. Because here we see that they have now been given an ultimatum of worship this image of gold or die. So now they've got the choice of they're either going to have to compromise or simply be thrown into the furnace. So with this being the situation, well, we now see what their response to this is. How do they deal with this ultimatum, knowing that it is a no-win situation where they either have to betray their faith or be killed immediately? That's the choice they've got. And we see the response to this comes out in 2 ways, all right? We see a couple of very important comments that shows what true faith should look like. So we see them say to the king in verse 16, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. So they're not going to go along with his demands, nor are they going to debate it with him. All right, basically, they're not going to negotiate. They'll simply refuse to do this. There's nothing else for them to say. And this stance is due to 2 reasons, right? Those 2 things that show us what true faith looks like. So they first would say in verse 17, if we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. So what they're really saying is, we don't fear you because we trust God. And we know that he can save us, and there's nothing that you, even as the king, could do about that. So they're making it clear that they're not afraid of him, so he can't make them comply. He's got no leverage here. And they won't comply because they know God is more powerful than what he is. They have faith that God will save them from him. Everyone else in the nation might be going along with it out of fear, and they're saying, we just don't fear you. We fear God more than we fear you. So right there is already an important point for us to know, and is even a bit like what was said by Peter in Acts 4, as mentioned before. The question of who do you obey and who do you fear disobeying more, God or a human being, a person, even a king? And their position is, in Daniel 3 here, is God is more powerful than you. More powerful than you, king, so we obey him. And we know that he has the power to save us from whatever you could possibly do to us. And if you remember back to verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar said, almost taunts them, he says, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? And their answer to that now, he was asking the question, what God will rescue you? Their answer is, our God can. We trust him and we are not afraid. So there's the first thing to learn about true faith. It is trusting that God is ultimately in control. That even when powerful people on earth, who may have tremendous power on earth, when they threaten to use their power against us in the world, it's knowing God is even more powerful than them. But the second thing here, which is really important, is what they then say in verse 18. This is actually an important one, because people these days often like to take verses in the Bible, verses like verse 17, out of context, and then they go and they do something stupid with the idea that God will save them from their stupidity. That by their faith, God will always act the way they want. So they arrogantly think that they can force God's hand by simply saying he'll deliver us from whatever issues we have, even the ones we make ourselves. Because verse 18 adds a lot of context to the statements of verse 17, because we shouldn't ever think that somehow faith makes us invincible. That by just having enough faith, we'll be rescued from any situation. That the kind of stuff we see in prosperity churches, if you just believe enough, you'll get it. Believe and God will always deliver what you want. You can force his hand. Because like how Jesus said to Satan when tempted, don't put the Lord your God to the test. We actually see a similar humble response also being given here. Because after saying that God is able, that he can, able to rescue them, they then say, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So what they're saying is, even if we were to know for sure that we're about to die in this fire that you're going to throw us into if we don't worship your idol, well, it's still not going to change our position. So they're simply responding to the king's threat by saying that we know that God can save us. If that's his will, we know he can and we believe that. But if he doesn't in this instance, because that's his will not to, well, it doesn't make our faith in him any less. It's not going to change anything. So there's a really important lesson there. Trust God, pray to him, rely on him, know that he's able to do all things. He is ultimately in control of all things. But if he doesn't do what we want or what we're expecting, then don't lose faith, but keep trusting in him anyway. That when we pray, we are to know and believe that God can do what we ask, but that he doesn't have to do it. And if he doesn't, then that's no excuse to lose faith. That God makes his own choices of what he is going to do or not going to do. God acts in the way that he knows is best. He's looking at the big picture. And even if we can't understand it because of our limited knowledge, it doesn't mean God is not in control or not trustworthy. And that's what they're saying to the king. They're saying God is able to save us, so we don't fear you. But if we die in the fire, well, that doesn't change a thing. We still have faith in our all-powerful God. And then with such faith being displayed and this unmovable stance that they've taken in defiance of the king's law, we see the result of this in verse 19, where he says, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. So if you remember, the king really liked these three men. That is why they had those high positions in the kingdom, which has brought scrutiny upon them in the first place. As we saw back in chapter 1, he was so impressed by them that he considered them better than anyone else in his court. So back in chapter 1, we read in verses 19 and 20 that the king found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And then it said, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And then just last week in chapter 2, after his dreams were interpreted, in verse 49, we read, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon. But now he sees their loyalty is ultimately to God. He can't accept that as his pride is blinding him. So his attitude towards them changes as they're no longer favored by him. And this kind of thing of moving from admiration to hate and from humbleness to pride, well, it becomes a trend. We're going to get this a lot from Nebuchadnezzar. And much like what we see with King Saul, if you remember the story of King Saul and David, we'll see this self-destructive behavior come out over and over again as his pride will result in these outbursts. Because we see several times in this book, Nebuchadnezzar first making a mistake and then seemingly learning a valuable lesson from it, only to then make the same mistake again and to not really change his behavior in the long run. And we are already seeing this here, right? The pattern's already starting to become clear. Because only last chapter, we also saw how when he learnt of God's big plan, he was humbled by it. We finished last week where he said to Daniel in verse 47, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you are able to reveal this mystery, showing that he was amazed by God. He was impressed, that he came to respect him and even started showing trust in him. And yet now he's forgotten all that. Because as we've looked at a couple of times now, in verse 15, when he threatened them, if you remember, he said there, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So he's gone from being amazed by God, having seen him work miracles in these very men, as well as acknowledging God's place as the ruler of the world and even having power over his own mind with the visions he had, to now going against God by building this idol and wanting to kill the very men that he was impressed by for refusing to worship it. And by not believing that God could save them and even taunting them by saying as much, he's clearly forgotten all that had happened before. Which is why we now see just how prideful and unstable he is, because he says he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So he's just lost all common sense at this point, which is why we read in verse 21 that they were thrown in. And then in verse 22, the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So their response, which has been made in faith and in total devotion of God, is not something the king, with all his pride, is able to tolerate. And as we see, he responds with what is simply madness. And it even gets his own soldiers killed due to what is his insane need to destroy these faithful men. But the lesson in this for us now is already made, and that is that those faithful to God cannot compromise and must also be willing to face the consequences of this. And that there will be those who will take such a faithful stand against their commands as even more reason to be hostile. That, like the response of Nebuchadnezzar here, in our society, not conforming with its demands is only going to cause what is explosive hate and intolerance towards such defiance. Which is really why we should have no doubt that as laws change in Australia, making it harder to be publicly faithful, that any defiance is only going to create harsher laws. That a consequence of standing strong will just be more pressure to conform and the heat being turned up. But the main point is, that what we see from these three is that there is a line and you cannot compromise when it comes to the worship of God. That you got to ultimately trust in him to be able to save you from the furnace, and also trust in him enough that if he doesn't, your eternal life is still safe and secure. That this is what true faith looks like. Never giving in, no matter what threats you may receive. Now, with this stance being made, and with the king losing the plot and having the furnace turned up to full heat, here is yet again where we see the pattern of the king's instability repeating itself. That whilst Nebuchadnezzar has lost control again and forgotten all that he saw and experienced, where his dreams and visions were just interpreted, and how he knows God has power to do this, and that these three men know God and they worship him. Well, having forgotten all that in his pride and rage, we now see where staying strong in faith can make God known. That by what these three men have said and their unwillingness to compromise, God's power is yet again revealed, and the king has to simply acknowledge that. He'll yet again have another change of heart. So we read in verses 24 and 25, having been thrown into the 7 times hotter furnace, the King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Now, this statement has been one of debate for years, and there is no real answer, right? Some say the 4th man was an angel sent by God to protect them. Something that we see happen elsewhere is angels appear as physical people. They do come to us appeared as just human beings. Others, however, say that this is Christ himself and that this is an example of the Son of God, making himself known before he came to earth, born as a human being. But whatever the case, the simple point is they should be dead, and yet someone sent by God has kept them safe. That there was a 4th person in the furnace, and that he was there to protect them, that it was a miracle, and we see that even the king can't deny that. He knows something impossible has happened that has visibly, the 4th person visibly kept these 3 men alive. Because we see in 26, it says here, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So we see again that he acknowledges the truth about God. The comment about them being servants of the Most High God shows that the king knows just what it is that has caused this miracle and why it is that they're alive. And we see as we read on that when they come out of the fire, that they don't have any sign at all of having even been in one, right? Not even the smell of fire is present on them. So everyone is obviously amazed by this. And as they all crowd around them, we said that they're unable to understand how could this happen? How could they not only have survived, but not even shown signs of having been in the furnace in the first place? And the response to this situation is, on the one hand, surprising, the shock of it, and yet at the same time, it's totally understandable. Because we read in verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. So this is now a complete 180 from what was verse 15, where he arrogantly said and asked, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? But the other option is there. But what other option is there but to now believe that their God has in fact rescued them from his hand? That there simply can be no denying that a miracle has happened just as they said God was able to do. Because as we looked at before, they said back in verse 17, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And now that this has happened, well, the king has to admit that God has more power than he does. So they were proven right not to defy God by worshipping this golden idol, which is where we get what is really the main point of all this. What it is we need to learn from this passage, and what is amazing about this is that it's going to be King Nebuchadnezzar that makes this point clear for us. His own words here are what gives us the big message of this passage for us today. Because we just saw how at the start of verse 28, he now praises God. And this is what he then says in the second part of verse 28. They trusted in him. So he acknowledges their faith in God and how that is what gave them their confidence and ability to stand strong. And that they defied the king's command. So he also accepts that they broke the law out of that faith, that they obeyed God and not him, and he now praises them for that. And then he says, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. So what he now states here is the extent of how far they would go because of their faith in God. How not even death, all that he threatened them with, could cause them to renounce their faith, but they stood their ground to what could have been their end. So we see that the king, despite his constant madness and his constant jumping back and forward in his position on these things, the king himself gets the message here, and therefore he makes the point for us as well, that their faith enabled them to not give in to a sinful law, and that no matter what the penalty was, they showed that true faith will be willing to face whatever the consequences of that stand could be. And then, just like the other times, we see the impact this event has on the king and the rest of Babylon. That again, God, by his miraculous work in here, will make an impact on how this nation works. Because the king says at the end of the chapter, therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So again, God has made himself known. And again, the king has seen this and reacted to it with praise for God and a new status being given to those who have stayed faithful to him. But in all these situations, it came down to people of God having that faith in order to make that stand no matter what. That how God works is for his people to, in faith, not hide their trust in him, but to boldly show it. That whilst God is the one at work, the way that God works is by working signs and miracles through his people, hence why he expects and demands his people to never give in, but to keep on always proclaiming his ways right to the end. So the big point for us today, what we should get from this passage and what we need to know is that when living in Babylon, when you're in a culture that goes against God and even expects you to then go and do the same, that there is a time to make a stand, even if that goes against what is the laws of the land. But just like in Acts with Peter, where he said he has to obey God, not man, so he will follow the laws right up to disobeying God. And then at that point, the line must be drawn. This shows that no one who has their faith in God can willingly go against his commands, as his laws are above all others. That Peter couldn't just stop talking about Jesus just because the Jewish leaders told him to, and nor could these three men fall before and worship an idol just because a Babylonian leader told them to. That these three men could not worship an idol of God just because the king said to, so they refused to comply out of faith to God. So we do see in many places in the Bible that whatever the commands people of this world may make, in the end, God's commands are the ones all people of faith must follow. That the important thing to know is that God's commands come before everything else. But then at the same time, We want to make sure we don't get this wrong. What we must also not forget is that what we see in all these examples are that when faced with this dilemma between two opposing requirements, that they were all prepared to face the consequences for breaking the commands of people. As we see here in this passage, they basically say here to what is the most powerful man on earth at the time, throw us in the fire if you must, but we will not follow your commands and worship your golden idol. Right? We won't give in. So even though they stood their ground, as an example to us, what we also see is it was never used as an excuse for rebellion, as they were prepared to face the consequences of that stand, of making that choice. They're just like with the apostles, when they stood before their Sanhedrin, they likewise were prepared to face whatever consequences there was for telling people about Jesus, as this is something that they would never stop doing no matter what the law said. So the examples that we are shown in the Bible are that God's people must remain faithful to the end, but also be ready to face the consequences of that stance. So that is the lesson for us now. And it's one that gives us so much guidance in how to live in this world that is becoming all the more hostile to God's ways. Because this is the one that gives us the framework on how to deal with that difficult situation that goes against our faith. When we're expected to say or support or do something that as a Christian, we just simply cannot agree with. Because many people do get confused on this, right? They ask the question, as a good Christian, how can I break rules, right? How can I go breaking laws? If I'm told to do something which is sin and that goes directly against the Bible's teachings, how can I not do it without them breaking the expectations to be a good, law-abiding Christian citizen? Am I not, by standing my ground, being one of those bad, rebellious Christians always looking for a fight? And the answer to that issue is in events like this. The exile in Babylon gives us a way to face such dilemmas. And it tells us you comply. Go along with the laws. Be the good, upstanding citizen until it is sin, and then you don't. You go with the rules of the land, but not if it means sinning against God or doing an evil act. And if it means losing a job or getting kicked off the sports team or getting cancelled on social media or some other consequence for making a stand, what a call is to make a stand and then be prepared to face whatever issues that raises. And we see here that when you do that, it can be hard, it can be difficult, but it can work out for the best. Such a stand can show others that God is there and lead them to trust him as well. It can even cause them to back down and realize they were wrong to do what they were forcing you to do. So the encouragement is don't get discouraged with where our society is going. That God's people have faced far worse, and in faith were able to not only not give in, but they were able to even win a few people to God's kingdom as well along the way. So what that means is for us, if the law says don't pray, pray anyway. If it says don't proclaim Jesus, keep doing it. And if it ever says you can't meet as a church, then find some underground basement and make that the meeting place. The lesson here is remain faithful even in the face of challenges and pressures to conform, and to just trust in God through it all.